All right, let's get started here. So we are picking up at 9:24, 1 Corinthians 9:24. So we're in the middle of a section. We're in the middle of the third, I would say, unit of about 5 units that comprise all of 1 Corinthians. So we're right in the middle of the letter now. First unit was a theological unit, approximately the first 4 chapters, emphasizing the unity of the church and why disunity cannot be accepted. Then from somewhere in the middle of chapter 4 through the end of 7, he's dealing with issues of sexual morality, family. And then in 8, he starts to pick up this issue of food, and specifically food sacrificed to idols. And that's the section we're still in, although in chapter 9, where we're now, he goes on a bit of a what seems like a tangent, but it is all connected. But we have to kind of pay attention how he's connecting these things. So if you just read chapter 8, which is a brief chapter, he seems to say about this question they have about food sacrificed to idols, eating this meat or food sacrificed to idols. He seems to take a pretty open approach. He says, well, yeah, it's true that these aren't real gods in any sense, etc. And that, he seems to acknowledge that they do have this freedom to do that. And if you stopped reading there, which a lot of people do, because they've already got the conclusion they wanted, you would kind of think, okay, no big deal, doesn't matter what I eat, move on. All right. But that argument doesn't end there. So he goes on, then in 9, he brings up this defense of his apostleship. Why? It seems like he's changing the topics. He dealt very quickly with what was a major issue, apparently, in 13 verses or so, and now he's just moved on. Well, that's not what he's doing. So he goes to this defense of his apostleship because he points to himself. He wants to look to him. He wants to use his own life as an example to them. And this was common in the Hellenistic period, in the Hellenistic world of his time, that the philosophers were, there had to be this kind of continuity between what they preached and what they actually did. All right, that makes sense. So he looks to himself. He says, look at me, for example. He says, I'm an apostle. Barnabas is an apostle. We have the right to be compensated for our work, ministering the gospel, but we don't take it. We work with our hands. We suffer indignation, suffer humiliation by undertaking, tent making was by no means any glorious profession, a very difficult one. And he says, we have a right to bring a wife too, and the church to support her as well. But he said, well, we don't take that right either, because it may present an obstacle to the gospel. So anything that's going to get in the way of spreading the gospel, I will renounce that right for the greater good. And that's the kind of the point. is yes, you have the right, but in some cases, you have to renounce your individual rights and freedoms for the greater good. All right. So he's just finished saying this, and now he uses this athletic imagery, which he does often in his letters, and not just St. Paul. It was common imagery. I mean, our culture here in America is very sport obsessed as well. I think it would be fair to say, but you see the same kind of interest anyway in the scriptures and with Paul using this athletic imagery. So he says, verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it, the prize. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things, moderate in all things. Now they do it, they undertake this temperance and competition. Now they do this to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. All right, so what's he talking about? So already in in Greece, ancient Greece at the time, you didn't only have the Olympic Games every 4 years, but there were other regional games. And the second biggest after the Olympics was the Isthmian Games, which were held in Corinth. They were held every 2 years as opposed to the Olympics every 4 years. But, all these different competitions throughout Greece, they each awarded some kind of crown, and each had its own kind of configuration. So I think it says, let's see. Yeah, so withered celery or pine garland was awarded at the Isthmian Games in Corinth, which of course all of Paul's hearers would have known. Paul also, we know, spent at least 18 months in Corinth, so it's likely that he was there for one of the games. And then at the Olympics, they used wild olive, parsley at the Nemean Games over on the east part of the Peloponnese. So it represents the trophy, the crown. And he's saying, well, they do all of that. They change their whole lives. And, and here it says, for example, everyone expected, just like our culture today, the athletes, they need this period of training and preparation. And for the Olympics, the athletes had to swear by Zeus to follow 10 months of strict training beforehand. So almost like, today, professional boxers, they'll go into camp, but maybe they'll fight once a year, maybe twice a year, and they'll have a camp before the fight where for 6 weeks at least, 2, 3, 4 months maybe, where they're intensely preparing for the game. All right, and he's saying, and they do all of that for some withered celery, a withered celery crown, right? So just perishable, passing, temporal, ephemeral human glory. And he says, so if they do that just for some withered celery, what kind of effort should we be putting forth in order to obtain this imperishable crown of glory from the Lord? Now, why is he saying this? How is this connected to the previous issue? Because he's trying to emphasize, all right, so he's saying, yes, you have the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols. You have the right, if you want to, enjoy these banquets with your friends at the pagan temples. But he says, so does an athlete. An athlete who is preparing for the Olympic Games, he has the right or the freedom to break camp, to break his training, to go gorge himself, to eat ice cream once in a while or every day if he wants. He has that right. But he chooses to curtail and limit that right for a greater good that he has decided to pursue. So, in other words, Paul is suggesting this to these wealthy elite Corinthians, that, yeah, you have this freedom, but maybe you should think, one, that it doesn't help others, and two, what is it that you really want? Where are you going? What's Paul is saying, when you became a Christian, you entered into the competition, right? So, and it's not enough as Christians, he's saying, for us just to kind of trot through the race and it's good enough that I was in it, that I participated. And then at the end, we're supposed to get a participation trophy, right? Like we have nowadays. Paul's saying, no, if you've signed up for this life as a Christian to follow Christ, to take up your cross and follow Christ, that doesn't mean that we just sit around all day eating and drinking at pagan banquets. He says, like, yeah, you can do that, but it makes no sense of your supposedly stated goal of running after Christ, following him. He's saying, if that's what you really want, and it is what you signed up for when you were baptized, then, you have to put on a different mentality where you have to be temperate and moderate in all things, just like an athlete who's training. So you need to temper or moderate some of these freedoms that you have for a greater good. All right, so 26. He says, therefore, this is how I run, not with uncertainty. In other words, he's not running in a hesitating way. When the race starts, he's taken off, right? Paul is running as hard as he possibly can. He's not pulling up and thinking about anything, hesitating. He's just single-mindedly focused on reaching the end. So that's how I run. That's how I compete in the foot race. And the foot race was the first of the events of the pentathlon. And then he switches the analogy a little bit. He says, thus I fight. This is the way that I fight. He's also referring to another big sport in the Olympics, which was boxing. And they actually had like, they would put on these like long leather gloves that were fingerless when they were boxing, or in the Pankration, which was another event, which was the best, kind of like wrestling, but I would describe it more like, today, the mixed martial arts, the MMA, UFC that you see on TV. I mean, the only thing that was forbidden, really, it's like wrestling, but you could strike, you could kick. The only thing that was forbidden was gouging the eyes and biting. Those were the only things that were not permitted. So we're talking about a very intense fight. So he says, so when I run hard. I run to win. And when I fight, like in a boxing match or in this wrestling match, I'm not fighting as one who beats the air. In other words, you see like today boxers in the hype videos and the commercials leading up to this pay-per-view event. You see these guys working out, right? And they're going like this and they're punching the air. But that's just for show. That doesn't do anything at all. I mean, just punching the air, you go in there and that's all the practice you've got is just punching the air. You go in there, you're going to get whooped. I mean, that is not going to help you at all. So he's saying, I'm not in here to get a participation trophy, right? He said, if I'm going to commit to this life, which I have, then I'm doing it with 100% focus and seriousness, that I'm dedicated. I want to win. I want to, I want to strive as hard as I possibly can. So he says, and thus, 27, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, exactly as the athletes would. But here he's talking about, he's talking about this spiritual contest that we enter into. And this is really apropos now with Lent, because, the fathers talk about, and you may hear this expression sometimes, it's expression in Greek, kalostadio, we say it during Lent, which literally means good stadium. Now, what good arena, something like that. Well, why would we say that? Well, the fathers say that when we enter into Lent and we start trying to discipline the body and take away some of the kind of material comforts, that we're entering into the contest, that it's like a boxer who, or a football player maybe in the off season, he's probably not going to let himself go entirely, but he's going to rest his body a little bit. He's not going to have as intense a training schedule. He's going to let his body heal a little bit. But then when it comes time for this season and it ramps up, he's all in. He's got to be fully committed. So Paul is kind of using this as an analogy that, now that the season began, the Olympics are here, the time has come. We're entering into this contest, this spiritual contest where we're grappling with, we're wrestling, we're fighting against demons and the power of the evil one. And so to do this like an athlete, I need to prepare myself. I need to train myself. I need to discipline my body and bring it into subjection. Subject it to what? The soul. To subject it to God. I was thinking the other, I always have this, pet peeve about when someone says, oh, it's just, be a good person, right? And then I was thinking, well, what would I prefer to say rather than just be a good person? I would say, I want to be a faithful person, not good, whatever that means, but faithful to God, to my commitments, to my oaths, to my baptismal vows, etc. That I want to be found. If you look through the scriptures, what's important is to be faithful to God. And so to do that, to be faithful to God, we need to train ourselves. It's not something that you can just, I talked about this before, like another of my pet peeves of, oh, Father, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles man. It's what comes out of the mouth. Right, exactly. I mean, I totally agree with that. But if you can't master the little things, how on earth are you going to master the big things, right? So, I mean, if you can't run 10 yards on a football field without tripping over your own feet, then, you're probably not going to be scoring a lot of touchdowns, right? So you need to master the first, the basic stuff first, build up the skill set, practice this kind of fundamental skill set. Then you have a foundation in which you can really compete and go beyond that. So this is like the spiritual life too. If we can't even control what we put in our mouth, how can we possibly control the tongue, which the scriptures and James tells us is the most unruly of all the members, right? So now, how does this tie into food? All right, so this all is a part of this food section. So part of what Paul's talking about is this slavery to the belly. And this is how the fathers universally read this passage, is that the Corinthians are slaves to their belly, in a sense. And thus they're not temperate and moderate in all things, like athletes who are really training to win, but they're kind of just floating through the season, collecting their paycheck, kind of thing. All right. So, and let's see here. Oh, so here's some quotes from the fathers about this imagery here. So Tertullian, who lived around 200, he says, your master, Jesus Christ, has anointed you with his spirit and has brought you to this training ground. He determined long before the day of the contest to take you from a softer way of life to a harsher regimen, that your strength may increase. So someone was telling me yesterday a story about, that something like, well, because it's Lent, they offered to someone who's also Orthodox. They said, well, we have this, but we have some vegan options over here. And the guy, typical smart aleck, says, well, God doesn't, you think God cares about that? And the answer is, in this particularly, no, God probably doesn't care in this particular case today on Monday at 9:11 a.m. or whatever, whether you eat this or that. But he does care, I think, like a father, that we not remain infants our whole life, right? He's not interested in infantilizing us and keeping us soft and permanently on milk, but that he hopes, like any good parent, that our children will grow in character, and that takes some discipline, that takes some hardship sometimes, going through difficult things, etc., but that he hopes we will mature and grow and become strong, so that our strength may increase as a result of doing these things. So does he care that, that we broke the fast, on this particular occasion? Maybe not particularly, but if that's our overall attitude, I think, which is kind of like the attitude of the Corinthians here, it kind of seems like, and Paul is kind of pushing back on that attitude. So Tertullian continues, athletes are set apart for more rigid training to apply themselves to the building up of their physical strength. They are kept from lavish living, from more tempting dishes, from more pleasurable drinks. They are urged on. They are subjected to torturous toils. They are worn out. The more strenuously they have exerted themselves, the greater is their hope of victory, right? Pseudo-Dionysius is probably a church writer from maybe the 5th century, but some say that it was Dionysius, who was the first bishop of Athens that Paul evangelized in Acts 17:18. So he says, the initiate is summoned to the sacred contest, which with Christ as his trainer, he must undertake. For it is Christ who, as God, arranges the match. As sage, as a wise one, he lays down the rules of the game. And as beauty is a worthy prize for the victors, the beauty of Christ. And more divinely, as goodness is present with the athletes, defending their freedom and guaranteeing their victory over the forces of death and destruction. And so the initiate will quite gladly hurl himself into what he knows to be divine contests, and he will follow and scrupulously observe the wise rules of the game. He will follow the divine tracks established by the goodness of the first of athletes. So again, this is our tradition. This is the traditions of our church, which include fasting and confession and so on. These are the 2,000 years of experience have hallowed this as the best training program we can offer, right? It's been crafted through experience of the saints over 2,000 years. So that's why we do it. Clement of Alexandria, a very early father, says quite simply, no effort, no crown. No effort, no crown. So Paul is turning the argument here against them. At first, he seems to say, okay, yeah, you have that right. he says, well, I look at myself, I have lots of rights, but, though they were an obstacle to you for various reasons, so I renounce them. And then he says, if we're going to commit to something, especially to following Jesus Christ, no effort, no crown. There's no participation trophies here. So he's tweaking his original statement, which seems to be, okay, yeah, you have that right. Cyprian, another very early father, 3rd century. This combat was foretold by the prophets, engaged in by the Lord, who as soon as he was baptized, what does he do? He goes and fights the devil by fasting, and carried on by the apostles. Ambrose says, you are an athlete. Come to grips with your opponent, not with your head, but with your arms. In other words, forget the words, forget the nice ideas about how you're free and blah, 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 blah. You're not going to win the game by, talking theory. You got to actually, if you're going to win the wrestling match, you got to use your arms. You got to get strong. Jerome, let our soul be in command and our body in subjection. So that's what Paul's talking about. That we have to subject our body to what? To God, to the soul, to the higher part of ourselves, rather than the other way around, where the body is commanding and directing the soul. So I've used this image before of, if you saw, if you were on a horse farm and you saw a man riding a horse, you wouldn't think anything of it. But if you saw a horse riding a man, you'd think that was pretty strange, right? Because it's an inverted relationship. The horse should not be the one commanding the man. The man is the one who's supposed to be in command of the horse, right? So the same with the body and the soul. The soul is the one who's supposed to be commanding the body and leading it, not the other way around. But if we even examine our own lives, I mean, how much are we led around by the nose by our physical desires, right? That it kind of determines how we spend our time, what we spend our money on, what we think about. All right, so Paul is saying, no, we have to reestablish a right priority. And then here's another quote: to pummel the body, as Paul says, that he pummels his body, pummels it, beats it, really works it. To pummel the body is to fast and to avoid any kind of luxury. Paul shows that he disciplines his own body so that he will not miss out on the reward about which he preaches to others. And then here's St. John Chrysostom. And here's the point that Paul is starting to get to now, and is going to continue in the next chapter. He said, here Paul is implying that the Corinthians are subject to the lusts of the belly and abandon themselves to it, fulfilling their own greediness under a pretense of perfection. If Paul, who had taught so many, was afraid of being rejected at the end, because he's saying that I run the race to win, that I might be found worthy perhaps of this crown. If he's not sure of his salvation, he doesn't have assurance of his salvation, then what can we say? Mere belief is not enough, St. John says. We must behave in a way which is blameless if we hope to inherit salvation. So Chrysostom continues, if Paul wrote these words, I pummel my body and bring it into subjection, lest while preaching to others, I might myself become disqualified, meaning disqualified from this game. In the Olympic Games, if you did certain things that were outside the rules, you were disqualified, right? So he talks about this in another place. You have to follow the rules, and lest you be disqualified, and then you can't win. You can't win the crown. If then that man, Paul, the object of so great favor, who was taken up into the third heaven, who heard and saw things which no eye nor ear can see or comprehend, who the risen Lord himself appeared to on the road to Damascus and made him the disciple, the apostle to all the nations, to change the whole world. If this man, despite such conspicuous prowess, felt the need to pummel his body, bringing it into subjection, submit it to the authority of the soul, and place its impulses under the virtue of the soul, what then would we say, deprived as we are of these virtues and with nothing to show in addition to this beyond deep indifference? After all, this war admits of no truce, does it? It has no set time for the assault, does it? So in other words, if this is Paul's attitude, who's had all these spiritual gifts bestowed on him, and he's not sure of his salvation, and he feels the need, no, I need to keep working. I need to keep striving. This is a marathon, not a sprint. He who endures to the end will be saved, as Christ says. Then he says, if Paul is in this position that he's not resting on his laurels and being like, I can just coast to victory, then what about us? What should we be doing? And this is the example this is the message Paul's trying to get across to the Corinthians. All right, so now we start chapter 10. This is a dense one here. All right. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. This is kind of a formula that, in other words, he's saying, I really need to underline a basic fundamental understanding for you. I don't want you to be unaware that all our fathers or ancestors, and interestingly here, he's going to be talking about the Exodus. He's going to be talking about the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. But we have very good reason to believe that in Corinth, he's talking to a good number of Gentiles. There may be some Jews there, but definitely a large number of Gentiles, probably the majority. So why is he talking about all our fathers? So he's including them. Because they've been grafted in to Israel, right? So it's not an ethnic or biological thing. And in fact, Father Stephen DeYoung, makes a really good point about this. He says that if you read the Old Testament carefully in Exodus, it was not an ethnicity that he brought out of Israel per se. I mean, they traced their lineage, obviously, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that, the famine and Joseph had brought them into Egypt. They fell into slavery, etc. But other people were kind of mixed in with this group that comes out of Israel through the Red Sea, wanders in the wilderness. And in fact, of that whole group of Israelites, only two people out of hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, a couple million, only two make it to the promised land, one of which is Caleb. And Caleb, it says, the Old Testament tells us he was a Kenizzite, which was like basically the people of the land of Canaan, the pagans that they're ordered to drive out. So it has no ethnic sense at all. It was already from the beginning this mixed group that God made a people from a people that weren't a people, he says. So Paul is saying all our fathers, we are all spiritual children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of this event and of the Exodus. So he says, all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All right, so what's he talking about? This was, we say that Paul is doing a midrash here, midrash. So what do we mean a midrash? Midrash is a kind of a rabbinic Jewish method, I would say, of approaching scripture. So very, 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 very common. And in fact, at this time in Jewish history, Paul's time, a lot of what most Jews would have heard from the scriptures would have basically been midrash, because at this time, one, the Old Testament's not fixed in any way. And that and Paul's going to quote in this chapter from the Septuagint, the Greek translation. He's going to quote verbatim from the Greek translation, not from the Hebrew. And at this time, almost nobody read Hebrew. It was like Latin or something like that. It was a dead language almost, but there were kind of related languages of Aramaic. Of course, a lot of Jews spoke Greek, and so the scriptures were translated into Greek, but a lot of times in Aramaic, they weren't translated exactly. They came across as midrash, which means that basically when someone takes a scriptural story and retells it as part of something else. For example, if I'm talking about, if I have a sermon and I'm retelling briefly a scriptural story, I'm not reading it word for word. I'm just kind of conveying it. I'm going to emphasize certain aspects of the story that fit my larger point, right? If I want to talk about love or forgiveness or something, I'm going to retell the story in such a way that it relates to my point, emphasizes that. So this is what Midrash was. It was these retelling of stories. So Paul is kind of retelling, doing a Midrash on the Passover here. And he's saying that this foundational event of Israel. So he's saying, all of our ancestors were under the cloud and passed through the sea. What does he mean? So after they passed through the sea, which Paul is saying was like a kind of baptism, where they passed through the water and then the water collapsed on the forces of evil and drowned the forces of evil, right? And thus they emerged from the other side free of this kind of evil that had been clinging to them and keeping them in slavery. And then what did they do after that? Then God led them as a cloud by day and as a pillar of fire by night. So he's saying that the Israelites, they were baptized and they had God leading them. And they all ate the same spiritual food. So what's he talking about here? He's talking about the manna in the wilderness. The rabbis, the Jews, all referred to this as kind of the spiritual food. And you see in the Gospel of John, Jesus talks in the same way about the manna of the Israelites in the wilderness. And all drank the same spiritual drink. All right, so now you can see he's tying in food and drink here. So he is staying with this theme of food and their original question of, can we eat meat sacrificed to idols in the pagan temples, etc. And so when he says, and all drank the same spiritual drink, what's he referring to? Okay, the spiritual food is the manna. Interestingly, though, in the Old Testament, it says that they fed on manna and quails. But the manna is what's kind of always intrigued people. What is this thing? And actually, manna in Hebrew means, what is it? It's kind of a Hebrew humor. All right, so, and all drank the same spiritual drink. What's that? For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. What is he talking about? A rock that followed them? All right, so you're not going to find this in the scripture, in the Old Testament. This is part of Jewish oral tradition, strong oral tradition, that we see many, many times that Paul accepts, right? So even Paul wouldn't have cut it as a Protestant because he doesn't only accept sola scriptura, right? So that spiritual arc, what's he talking about? So the people of Israel in their 40 years wandering in the wilderness as they move toward the promised land, God feeds them with manna from heaven. And what about water? Well, if you remember, they would complain about that too. We don't have enough water. We don't have water. We're in the middle of the wilderness. How are we going to get water? So now remember what happens with this incident. So you have this incident where the people of Israel are grumbling against God, and they're totally in the wrong. But God he says, there's this dispute between him and Israel. And God says, okay, I'll give you water. So he tells Moses, he says, take your rod. And the rod was the symbol of authority. I mean, which is why the bishop, for example, has a rod, a staff. So the rod was a symbol of authority. It was a symbol of kind of executing judgment. Also, for example, when they took the rod and struck the Nile, and the Nile turned to blood, right? This was the judgment of God against Egypt. So he tells Moses, go to this rock, and this is the part a lot of people forget. He actually says, and I will be standing on that rock. And then he says, Moses, I will be standing on the rock, and you strike me. You strike the rock. He doesn't strike me. He says, you strike the rock that I'm standing on, and water will come out of it. Water that will literally save their lives, right? Otherwise, they're dead. I mean, and every person living in the desert knew that. No water, death. So now what's going on with this imagery? So Moses strikes the rock that God is standing on. And Paul says, and that rock was Christ. That rock was Christ, who was struck for us, and from which flowed blood and water. that provides our sustenance, right? So the same spiritual drink. We also drink of the water and blood, in this case, that flows from the side of the stricken God, Christ, who was crucified for us. So he says, so what does it mean that followed them? Okay, so you had that first incident where in Numbers, where Moses strikes the rock and the people of Israel drink. There's another incident later when also Moses strikes the rock, right? And there, God tells him, again, the people of Israel are grumbling about lack of water. And Moses seems to kind of be, let's say, losing his patience, losing his faithfulness, right? The people of Israel have just driven him totally crazy, and he's about to kind of succumb with them, right? And they're grumbling. And so he goes to God again, and God says to him, okay, go to the rock and speak to it. Speak to the rock. This is what it says in the Old Testament. It doesn't say go strike the rock, go speak to the rock. Because the rock symbolizes God, right? That God absorbed the blows, the complaints of the Israelites, even though they were unjust, but he absorbed it. He gave them life out of it. But then from that point forward, they speak to the rock. They don't strike it, they speak to it. So what does Moses do? He gets angry and he strikes the rock, right? He strikes the rock against God's command. And that is when God comes in and says, okay, that's it. You're not getting into the promised land either, because Moses, in effect, by striking the rock, he knew what he was doing. And he was joining Israel in complaining against God. Before this point, Moses was the mediator, right, between God and Israel. Now Moses kind of sides with the Israelites and is mad. He strikes the rock again. And God says, all right, that's it. If you're going to act like the Israelites, you're going to share in their fate as well, which is not to see the promised land. So the spiritual rock that followed them. And this is nowhere in the Old Testament, but it's all over the Midrash, the oral tradition of Judaism of Paul's time, that people started to ask, rabbi scholars started to ask, well, how is it that the manna kept coming down every day, right? So they could eat. But how are they drinking, right? So they're in the wilderness. They're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They have daily food, but what about water? You can't live without water. So, and it doesn't say anything in the Old Testament. So they started to kind of speculate in this Midrash, and the tradition developed that Paul accepts here, that the rock that they struck actually followed them in the wilderness. The rock, that original rock that Moses struck correctly at God's command, actually followed them in their wanderings in the desert so that they would always have water. So that's what Paul's talking about. He's accepting that tradition, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So this is how they ate and drank the spiritual food and the spiritual drink. But okay, so he's saying, look at what God did in the Exodus for our forefathers, Israel. He says, they were baptized in the Red Sea, washed away their enemies that kept them in slavery. They were led directly and visibly by God in a cloud or during the day in a pillar of fire at night. They ate spiritual food that God rained down from heaven. They drank from a rock. I mean, everyone knows, what's the say? You can't get blood from a stone. Everyone knows you can't get water. You can't get life from a rock, right? But God, who created all things out of nothing, he can do it. Who created the whole world through his son and the word, Jesus Christ, he can do it. So Christ is that rock. Out from nothing, he produces life for them. And so they had all these advantages, all these things that God did to them. And yet, verse 5, he says, but with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness, meaning a lot of them died as punishment. He's going to explain that in the next verses. So why is Paul bringing this up? So he's saying, yeah, you have this freedom. You can do whatever you want. You can eat meat sacrificed to idols. Yeah. That's your right. Sure. He says, as for me, I renounce my rights when when it's about other people, because I'm seeking others' advantage. I've entered into this contest, and it's not enough just for me to be a member. I need to play. I need to actually be involved. This is a message for us Christians today, that, many of us, well, I'm a member of the church, so I'm just like saved by proxy. No, not good enough. No effort, no crown. That's what Paul says. So he's saying, now look at all these things that God did for the Israelites. Who could be more blessed? Who could have experienced more directly God's love and revelation than these people? And yet, most of them were lost. Only 2 entered into the promised land. So again, it's this kind of the same message as the athletic imagery, that, you guys, when you became Christian, when you were baptized, that wasn't the end. This is what they seem to think, is that was the end. And the part of it's their misunderstanding of the end of time, the resurrection of the body, which he's going to describe in chapter 15 in a hugely important chapter. But he's saying, God, you're not just once saved, always saved. You gotta get to work. All right, so that's what he's saying there. Let's see. Oh, here's Saint Ephrem the Syrian. He says, I considered the word of the Creator and likened it to the rock that marched with the people in Israel in the wilderness. So Saint Ephrem the Syrian, who knows the Aramaic languages and all these Midrash of the Jewish tradition, he doesn't even hesitate. I mean, the rock marched with the people in Israel. It says that nowhere in the scriptures. It was not from the reservoir of water contained within it that it poured forth for them glorious streams. There was no water in the rock, yet oceans sprang forth from it. Just so did the word fashion created things out of nothing. Origin says, Paul wants to remind us that we are not saved merely because we happen to have been the recipients of God's free grace, like the Israelites of old in the wilderness. We have to demonstrate that we are willing recipients of that free gift. The children of Israel received it, but they proved to be unworthy of it, and so they were not saved. This is his message to the Corinthians, right? It's not over. Just because you are baptized doesn't mean now you can just rest the rest of the time. You got to sacrifice. You need to be temperate in things. All right. Any questions so far? All right. So now this next section is approximately verses 16 to 13. He says, now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This is an exact verbatim quote from the Subjection. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, grumble, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. The destroyer, interestingly, that word doesn't appear very often, but it's the same exact word used of the angel of death who took the firstborn of Egypt in the Passover. Now, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So in general, Paul is interpreting the Old Testament allegorically, midrashically, to apply it to the people of today. He's not a literalist, a fundamentalist in his reading. Okay, so what's he talking about? The events recorded in the law were meant as a sign or warning to others. The Israelites' evil desires consisted in desiring better food than the manna. They complained, remember, oh, we're tired of the same worthless food all the time. The spiritual food that God had provided. What did they want? They wanted meat. They wanted meat. They craved, it says, here, Israelites' inordinate desire for meat and for the food of Egypt. This inordinate craving led to their death. The Israelites craved for meat from Egypt, right? So this is the connection with the whole argument going back to chapter 8. He's saying, now look at these Israelites. They were given every gift of God, and yet their belly was causing them to rebel against God, right? Because all they could think about was the meat and the times back in Egypt when they were in slavery, but their bellies were full. And so that's all that matters, right? Their bellies were full. They were content. And so even though they were being held by evil, didn't matter. So this is clearly a case where the body is dictating to the soul. If you're willing to accept slavery and misery and death just to have your belly full, then yeah. All right. So Paul's drawing this connection. He's saying, look at all these things. These were written for our instruction and admonition. They were baptized. They were given all the spiritual food and drink, which is Christ. And what did they want? They wanted meat of Egypt, of slavery, of evil. So what's he saying to the Corinthians? You are baptized into Christ. You are given freedom from slavery. You are given the spiritual food and drink, which is the Eucharist, which he's going to start talking about in a few verses. But don't think that that means you're just automatically saved and can do whatever you want, because look at the Israelites. When they desired with intemperance all these things and succumbed to them, then they were met with, they died in the wilderness. They didn't get to see the promised land. He's saying the same thing's going to happen to you. You are given the gift of baptism. You are cleansed. You are redeemed. You are given the spiritual food and drink in the Eucharist of Christ himself. And you're desiring your old way of doing things, the pagan meat sacrificed to idols, your fellowship and networking with your pagan friends and eating in the dining rooms of the pagan temples. So let's see. Yeah, so this quote where he says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, that is from Exodus 32. So Exodus 24, Israel had eaten in God's presence, but in Exodus 32, they ate and drank before an idol whom they called God. Later rabbis considered this the most embarrassing episode in Israel's history. And what does it mean? So when it says they ate and drank and got up to play, it can mean play in a more innocent sense, but it also means, and this is how it's been universally taken, to refer to kind of sexual immorality, promiscuity. And what did they do particularly? Here it says, explains the Israelite men had unmarried sex with Midianite women who were acting as cultic prostitutes. In other words, it was part of this religious ritual that they would have sex with these men and then bring them to their temple. So why is Paul telling us all this? So what are the themes? If we stop for a second, what are all these? What's the connection? Eating, meat, idolatry, sex, sexual immorality. All these themes we've seen before, Paul says. And so when you come to me with these questions and problems that are involving eating, idolatry, sexual immorality, well, let's look at the scriptures. The scriptures should be instructive for us. This is what he's doing here. Eating and drinking as they did, the Israelites could not have been more audacious in their idolatrous behavior or more egregious. So in other words, they sat down and ate, and then they got up to play was always taken, even by the Jews before Christianity, as referring to this sexual immorality with the Midianite women that was idolatrous. All right, so then he says, yeah, when he talks about the 23,000 who fell. So this is interesting too, because it actually doesn't say 23,000 anywhere in the Old Testament. It refers to an incident from Numbers in which many Israelites were guilty of sexual immorality with Moabite women, who also invited them to their altars. The result of this combined sin of sexual immorality and idolatry was the death of 24,000 men. This is what God judged them, and 24,000 Israelite men died. And at the time of the golden calf incident, the Levites slew 3,000 men. So Paul says 23,000 fell, and people basically, fundamentalists, literalists, are just wringing their hands about, well, why does he say 23,000? Because that doesn't appear. Is he referring to the 24? And then some say, well, it must have been a tradition that 23 died that day and then 1,000 died the next day, and together it was 24. So they're doing all these gymnastics to, there's no evidence for that, just to kind of make up some number, because the scriptures have to be totally inerrant. So how could Paul, he can't just have mixed up the numbers. But it's possible that he mixed up the numbers because of the 3,000 from the golden calf incident and the 24. He combined them somehow and said 23, because at that time the rabbis, they didn't quote chapter and verse all the time. They weren't quoting necessarily always exactly, but they were retelling the story to make a point, like Midrash. And so he's writing from memory. So that's probably why that we get that strange number. Let's see. Therefore, let's just finish here with verses 10 and 12. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So these strong, wealthy, elite Corinthians who see themselves as so spiritually strong and knowledgeable and wise, he's kind of telegraphing to them, well, I'm seeing a lot of parallels here with what happened to the Israelites in the wilderness, and we all know how that one ended. So he's saying, maybe, you who think you think you stand, you think you're so strong, you think you're saved, whatever, maybe you need to take heed lest you fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. In other words, God has not sent some particular spiritual trial your way. The temptations that you are dealing with and all these kind of questions that you wrote to me about the sexual immorality, about the eating meat sacrificed to idols, saying all these temptations and trials, they're really not that big a deal. This isn't some like spiritual agony that you're going through. All of these things are common to our existence as human beings. So he's kind of saying like, we really should be better than this. You should be able to subject those needs of the human body to the soul and overcome these temptations. And in fact, he says, God is faithful and he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. So he's giving them a word of encouragement here. I mean, he's strongly admonishing them, but then he has a little word of encouragement, and he says, this temptation really is just a temptation. It's a very human temptation that we like, that our belly and our sexual desires lead us around by the nose, even when we're supposedly in training for something much higher. He said this is a very human temptation. It's something you should really easily be able to, not easily, but you should be able to overcome this. In fact, God will give you the ability to do that. All right. And St. John Chrysostom says on this, anyone who relies on himself will soon fall. So if Paul, so St. John's saying, if Paul is worried about his own salvation, of being accounted worthy at the end of the crown, if he's worried, then all of us need to be really worried about that and really kind of get on our horse and start taking things a little more seriously and start to run and compete in the game as if we're actually trying to win, like let's get to it. So this is all part of his message in response to this question of, can we eat meat sacrificed to idols? So it's very interesting. It's a very Orthodox way of responding, because what they want is they just want, yes or no. Can we do it or can we not do it? But what he's giving them is a much fuller answer. He's saying, yeah, you can. But then he starts to pile on all these reasons why they shouldn't. And it gets to the point finally where he does give them the answer they're looking for later here in chapter 10, where he forbids them from participating in these activities. But he doesn't, if he had just said that right away at the beginning, if he had cut out all these chapters and just said, as for the meat sacrificed to idols, forget it. You can't go there. It's communing with the devil. It's communing with demons. They probably would not have taken or understood his deeper point, right? So this is part of an Orthodox answer to questions, which, so I think particularly for Westerners, it can be frustrating because we're just trying to get pinned down a precise answer, but that's not the Orthodox phronema to think that way. And I'll end with one story that I heard recently that I thought was great. Actually, our bishop told this one to me. He said, everything depends on how we ask our questions. So to depend on what kind of answer we get, because the Orthodox answer is always crafted to the person and to the question, the specifics. We're not just kind of having some general ethics, but to each particular situation. So he said, there are two middle-aged men in Greece, and this, maybe picture 30, 40 years ago, everyone smoked, right? But they kind of knew it wasn't good, but a lot of people smoked. And so these two men, they're talking to each other. They have the same spiritual father, and they're going to confession. And the one goes into the spiritual father, and he says, Father, I try to pray. I have this, I do smoke, which isn't good. I try to pray. But he said, and I know smoking's bad, but when I'm smoking, sometimes I want to pray. Is that okay? And the spiritual father says, of course, you can always pray. We should be praying all the time, right? What's he supposed to say? I mean, that's the Orthodox front of me. You're encouraging this good instinct that he has, right? That he wants to pray. Okay, so the guy says, oh, okay. He goes out. His friend goes into the spiritual father. His friend says, he says, sometimes when I'm praying, I want to smoke. Is that okay? And the spiritual father said, are you crazy? He said, no, you can't break out smoking in the middle of prayer. And so the man said, okay. And he goes out, and he and his friend talk to each other. And they say, well, what did he tell you? What did he tell you? And one guy says, oh, he told me I can smoke when I pray. And another said, he told me I couldn't. And they start getting in an argument and but the key is they weren't listening to what he really said, right? And it's all about that's the Orthodox frame and how he answered the question, right? He didn't just, open some book and, well, according to paragraph 3, section G, thou shalt not, da, 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 da. He takes where each person is coming from, their kind of mental stance coming into it, and he tries to work with that, right? So I don't know if that makes any sense, but so Paul doesn't just come out and give a straight answer all the time, which could be frustrating, but he makes you listen to the reason and how he gets to that answer. All right, anybody have any questions? Otherwise, we'll pick up at 10:14 next time.
I have a question concerning the rock that followed them.
Yeah.
And you said that it is not, I know it's not in the scripture, but although Paul says the rock that followed them, but you mentioned that in the Midrash, they actually discussed these things, or was it in the Talmud, or, I mean, where was it discussed by the rabbis in the gatherings, and was it put down on paper in the tradition of
eventually, yeah, there are writings. They're not in any of the canonical Old Testament books. They're not even in the extended Old Testament canon like we see in the Ethiopian church, which has like 70 books or so in the Old Testament. It includes a lot of older writings, but it does appear in these Midrash, which Midrash are basically translations in a sense for the common people, I guess, of the scriptures. So in the retelling of the story, where they kind of add or fill in their minds details that were passed over in the Old Testament. But, as we look at it, we say, well, I don't know where they got that from, because that's not what it says. But to them, this is an artificial distinction that we impose on the scriptures. They didn't think about the scriptures in the same way we do. So, I mean, it's basically in the Midrash, these translations of those books into, let's say, Aramaic, that we see this theme come up again and again and again and again, such that it's no surprise that Paul quotes it basically or mentions it as established fact, as everyone accepts this. Like he does also elsewhere. He says, he talks about how the law was mediated to Moses through the angels, and he just states it as a fact, but that's not at all what it says in the Old Testament. But that was a developed oral tradition by Paul's time. So, yeah, I mean, they actually, the rabbis kind of play with this idea a lot, and sometimes they'll talk about a well that traveled with them. which is another odd image.
The word midrash in Arabic is a similar word called madrasa. The sh comes an s sound, and that pertains to a school that children study in.
Like the Islamic schools, yeah.
School, like I went to the madrasa when I went to primary school, or it means school, going to school.
Yeah.
Same identical word in the Hebrew and the Arabic. Midrash, and always sh sound. When in Arabic the same word becomes an s sound, like Rosh Hashanah becomes Ras Hashanah, and that's what it means. It means a school. So I just wondered whether that's just a tradition or was actually pertain to a school, like wherein they studied the scriptures.
I think it comes out of the kind of pre-proto-rabbinic schools, so already these schools that are developing in the diaspora in particular, that are headed, these kind of cultural centers for Jews across the Mediterranean world, where they gather together to synagogues, what we would eventually call synagogues. It's coming out of these schools of the rabbis who gathered together for studying the law. And so, and then there are different schools of rabbis who follow certain rabbi leaders, etc. But they're all kind of share some commonalities. They may disagree on some details. So I think it's coming out of these basically rabbinic schools of
some the rock followed them, actually. Did you say that some of them believe that the rock in the desert actually followed the Israelites?
Yeah.
Okay, I just
wanted. Yeah, I mean, it seems like universal. Even, I mean, it's not even a question. It's all over the place that they're speculating about this, and even take it as kind of established, because otherwise they can't figure out. I mean, when we say figure out, we don't mean kind of rationalistically. They mean they have the biblical mind. They're living in this biblical world, and then they can't figure out, in the biblical sense, the biblical narrative, well, how did they drink for 40 years in the middle of the desert without water, right? So they're just answering kind of a practical question. But, that's a different thing from stepping back and saying objectively, like we do as rationalists, like, well, that's impossible, and the whole thing probably didn't happen, or, whatever. Somehow we justify it that way. Instead, they think creatively, right? They think it must have been that the rock followed them, and why was that? What was this rock? All right. Well, let's see. I kept you guys long enough, probably. So I think we're on for next week, the 22nd. We'll continue with chapter 10. So now, in the end of chapter 10, and then in chapter 11, he's going to get into the Eucharist. So which will kind of complete this whole section about eating food, sacrifice to idols, etc. All right.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Father.
Blessed. Bye.
Bye-bye.